While the concept of capitalism, as understood today, with its focus on industrial production and global markets, originated in Europe around the 16th century, ancient India and China had thriving economies with features that could be seen as early forms of capitalism. And these features included extensive trade, market development, monetary systems, and merchant organizations that could be considered the building blocks or precursors of capitalism. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Karl, and today we take a look at different forms of political and economic systems like capitalism, communism, socialism, and their relation to democracy and authoritarianism. Though scholars had written about various aspects of economics, but in 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations and became the first person to produce a comprehensive philosophical examination of the way nations should manage their economies. Adam Smith argued that the invisible hand of the marketplace guided people when they made their own economic decisions. By doing the work that would bring them the greatest profit, Adam Smith explained that people inadvertently tended to produce the goods and services most needed by society. And to allow the invisible hand to work, Smith advocated the reduction of tariffs and most forms of governmental regulation. And the system was called commercial society, which later on came to be termed capitalism. An economic system in which private individuals and companies owned the means of production, such as factories and farms, and free and unregulated markets set the value of most of the goods and services based on supply and demand. Incidentally, Adam Smith was very critical of slavery. He believed that slavery was inefficient and doomed to fail if markets were truly free. Because the cost of feeding, clothing, and housing enslaved people, even though done very poorly, was passed on to the consumers. And because of this, the goods made by enslaved labor were more expensive. According to Smith, free labor could produce goods more inexpensively because the employer did not have to pay for the upkeep of his laborers. Capitalism started out okay. Small companies were able to make a small amount of money, and entrepreneurship was available to almost anyone with a small amount of capital. But then came the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization set in, and a few of those small companies became larger ones, much larger ones. And as a result, the individual laborer, who had been relatively important to the small employer, was reduced to insignificance and powerlessness. And there weren't many choices. You could either work for the big company in town and make a tiny bit of money, or you could not work at all. Even children were working. And the state of affairs was reflected very well in two novels of the time, Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist in 1837 and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables in 1862. And it was against this backdrop that workers began to rise up against their employers. Strikes became rampant and began to be looked upon as the only tool in the workers' arsenal against low wages and high hours. But the conditions of the average worker were never great. So what changed? Well, the big and massive change was monarchies had been replaced by democracies. And that meant the average individual finally had a voice. And with the success of the French and American revolutions, anti-capitalism thought became more prominent. And around this time, we start to see the talk of socialism and communism start making an appearance. The primary issue was that it shouldn't be the rich capitalist making all the money at the expense of the workers who labored for it. In 1848, Karl Marx from Germany, who had studied law at the University of Berlin, published the Communist Manifesto with co-author Friedrich Engels. In the book, the two argued that the history of all existing society is the history of class struggles. So recognizing the class struggles between the workers and the ruling class came to be termed as Marxism. They predicted that society would eventually replace the current economic systems with socialism, which was a system in which the public, not private companies or individuals, would own the means of production. Socialism, meaning society, owned the means of production, as opposed to capitalism, where the capitalists owned the means of production. Subsequently, in 1867, Karl Marx published Das Kapital, which is history's most cited source on economics and politics. In Das Kapital, Marx argued that the bourgeoisie, or members of the class that owned the means of production, were primarily motivated by the desire to exploit labor. In his view, the workers, or the proletariat, were paid far less than the worth of their labor. Employers then used these profits to purchase additional resources and to buy political influence to ensure that the law would support the wealthy instead of the workers. The employers continued to grow their economic and political power until the workers were left powerless and in poverty. And because of this, he felt that eventually the capitalist system would collapse and the workers would reclaim control of society. So what's the difference between socialism and communism? Communism is sometimes referred to as revolutionary socialism, essentially taking Karl Marx's theories to an extreme end. Marxists often refer to the transition as a three-step process, that is, capitalism to socialism to communism. In fact, Marx and Engels themselves did not clearly differentiate between socialism and communism, and that's why a lot of these theories have emerged. Communism entails communal ownership. Essentially, society is a big community. Each person receives a portion based on what they need. And to establish and enforce this concept of a strong communal society, a strong central government is needed. Since the state controls all aspects of economic production and provides citizens with their basic necessities, most of the communist governments have ended up becoming authoritarian. By contrast, under socialism, individuals can still own property. Industrial production, or the chief means of generating wealth, is communally owned and managed by a democratically elected government. Another very interesting difference between socialism and communism is the means of achieving them. In communism, a violent revolution in which the workers rise up against the middle and upper classes is seen as an inevitable part of achieving a pure communist state. Socialism, on the other hand, is less rigid. It too seeks to change and reform, but insists on making these changes through a democratic process within the existing social and political structure. The first group to put the Marxist theory into practice were the Bolsheviks, who created the world's first communist government in Russia in 1917. In the early 20th century, many Russians were furious with their government. Farmers paid high taxes and factory workers endured poor working conditions. And on top of all of this, the country had experienced two unpopular wars, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05 and World War I. Amidst this turmoil, a group of working-class women took to the streets of Petrograd, which is now St. Petersburg, in February of 1917. They were protesting food shortages and high bread prices. Over the next few days, hundreds of thousands of people joined the protests. Eventually, military leaders also defected to their side. And by March of 1917, Russia's head monarch, Tsar Nicholas II, had to abdicate the throne. With the monarchy toppled, the natural inclination was towards the setup of a democracy. And the Russians did get democracy for approximately 7 months before Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks staged a coup and started the process of implementation of Lenin's vision for a Marxist Russia. In his writings, Marx had mostly refrained from recommending any specific policies that leaders should enact to create a communist society. Vladimir Lenin was the first person to attempt to translate Marx's writings into actual policy. So, how did the first implementation of communism work out? In theory, the working class was supposed to govern through Council of Workers and Peasants. But in practice, the Communist Party, dominated by the Bolsheviks, created a new class of Communist Party officials and bureaucrats who effectively became the new bourgeoisie. So while the Bolsheviks became the new wielders of power and authority, Russia broke into a civil war from 1917 to 1922 with various factions seeking to control Russia. And the main contenders were the Bolshevik-led Red Army and the anti-Bolshevik White Army. And because of the civil war, Lenin implemented a few extreme policies on the economic front. And they started with the state nationalizing and taking control of major industries, banks, and financial institutions. The most extreme policy, though, was the seizure of surplus agricultural produce from peasants to feed the Red Army and the urban populations. This led to a severe decline in agricultural production and widespread famine between 1921 and 1922. And Lenin further took Russia virtually back into the Dark Ages, with the use of currency being severely limited, while the state attempted to replace trade with a system of bartering and rationing. This set of policies implemented by Lenin during the Civil War are often referred to as war communism. Interestingly, though, Lenin recognized the failure of the war communism economic policies and came up with a new economic policy which lasted from 1921 to 1928. And the primary tenet of the new economic policy was the concept of a mixed economy, that is, private enterprise operating in parallel with state-owned industry. On the agricultural side, peasants were finally allowed to sell surplus produce after paying a fixed tax. And most importantly, the new economic policy drifted further from Marxism by opening up trade with capitalist countries like England. So the first experiment in implementation of Marxism led to a realization that Marxism on its own was not sustainable. And the new economic policy of Lenin did yield positive results. Russia witnessed an economic recovery through increased production in both agriculture and light industry. The new economic policy, though, was terminated by Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, in 1928. Germany under Nazism was more of a military state than a communist state. And interestingly, it followed the mixed economy model as well. So while the Nazis maintained and encouraged private ownership of businesses, the state exerted significant control and influence over the economy, particularly in industries which were vital to the war effort. The government formed partnerships with big businesses, and these relationships benefited from favorable contracts, subsidies, and the suppression of the labor movement. The core tenet of the Nazi economic policy was the centralized economic planning, which was essentially the four-year plan to direct resources and production towards military goals. And this involved regulating prices, wages, and trade to align with government objectives. Independent trade unions were banned, strikes were outlawed, and wages were frozen at low levels. Nazism basically was neither interested in capitalism nor the average worker. It was an ideology primarily rooted in nationalism, racism, and authoritarianism, and the economic policies were tailored to serve the state. So the big problem with socialism and communism was that it did not consider what would happen when instead of the capitalists, the government officials started making money. Suddenly, it was not the rich guys with too much control, it was the government with too much control. The government was not too good at making money, and there was no motivation to do so because there was no competition. And the results were very visible in the fact that the overall average citizen ended up being poorer. So while this experimentation with socialism and communism was going on, some of Western Europe and the United States of America decided to do something different. Instead of saying, let's get rid of capitalists altogether, these countries ended up saying, let's regulate the capitalists instead. So in 1935, US President FDR legalized unions and established a 77% tax on incomes in excess of $1 million a year. In 1938, FDR passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which prohibited child labor, established a minimum wage, defined a 40-hour work week, and forced time and half pay for anyone who worked more than 40 hours in a week. Western Europe implemented something very similar. And the end result out of this was that the capitalists and their companies survived this bout of regulation, while for the workers, it was a massive triumph. After World War II, though, capitalism really took off. People had saved money, so they started spending money, which meant companies needed to make more things, which created more jobs, so people made more money. So the people in capitalist countries became more prosperous, while those in the communist countries just ambled along. And finally, in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became very clear that communism was not working. In fact, the other big communist economy, China, had already switched over to a market economy. However, as capitalism exploded into the 21st century, there has been an increase in income disparity across the people within an economy. Some economists now classify capitalist systems into two broad categories: the classical capitalist economies and the liberal capitalist economies. Classical capitalism tends to be associated with higher income inequality than liberal capitalism. In classical capitalism, a group of people receives income entirely from the ownership of assets, while another group receives income entirely from labor. And the group of countries that can be classified as classical capitalists are Latin America and India. In liberal capitalism, a significant percentage of people receive incomes from both capital and labor. The share of income, though, derived from capital increases as we move higher in the income distribution, but very often the rich have high capital and high labor incomes. This group comprises most of Western Europe, specifically the Nordic countries, Japan and China, and some of North America. Interestingly, two developed economies, the United States and Israel, are considered to be closer to the classical capitalism than liberal capitalism. However, there are a few countries that tend to stand out beyond the liberal capitalists too, in the sense that they have achieved relatively low levels of income and wealth inequality. And prominent among this group of countries are Taiwan and Slovakia. In the mid-20th century, Taiwan redistributed land to farmers, which is believed to have played a significant role in reducing the initial wealth gap. Taiwan also has a very progressive taxation system, which aims to collect a higher percentage of income from the highest earners. And this helps a lot in the redistribution of wealth. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. A massive shipwreck in 1606 at Bermuda is believed to have inspired one of Shakespeare's plays, which referred to Bermuda or Bermudes as a vexed or cursed place. Which play was this? In The Tempest, Shakespeare refers to Bermuda as the still vexed Bermudes. So the answer is A, The Tempest. Question for the current episode. The Gini coefficient is a statistical measure of wealth distribution and is used to gauge economic inequality by measuring wealth distribution. Based on the 2025 Gini coefficient, which countries display the highest wealth inequality? Are these A, Hong Kong, Botswana, and Brazil? B, India, Zambia, and Angola? C, Brazil, India, and South Africa? Or D, South Africa, Namibia, and Colombia? Once again, which countries display the highest wealth inequality based on the 2025 Gini coefficient? Are these A, Hong Kong, Botswana, and Brazil? B, India, Zambia, and Angola? C, Brazil, India, and South Africa? Or D, South Africa, Namibia, and Colombia? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We meet again in 2 weeks with another interesting and exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.